All right. Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking all about getting a new drug to market.
Yeah, it's a fascinating process.
It really is, and it's something I think a lot of people are curious about,
Mm,
but it can get really complicated really fast.
it definitely can. You've got science, you've got regulations, you've got patients all coming together.
Absolutely. And we're going to try to cut through all of that today and pull out some of those key insights that I think will make things a little bit clearer.
I think that's the goal, right? To make this complex process a little more digestible.
Exactly. And to do that, we've pulled information from scientific publications, regulatory guidelines, some real-world case studies.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is dense,
Oh, absolutely.
but there are some real gems in there that can teach us a lot.
So I think the mission today is to really connect the dots between those successful trials that you need, those regulatory milestones you've got to hit, and how that all culminates in a new medicine actually being available to patients.
Yeah, like a big picture view of the journey, if you will.
Exactly. We're not going to be able to hit every tiny detail, obviously,
Of course not.
but we want to give everyone a solid grasp of how this whole process works.
Sounds like a plan to me.
All right, so let's start by talking about phase 3 trials.
Okay.
Now, these are often seen as like the culmination of all that research and development that's come before it.
That's right. You've done all this work in the lab, in earlier trials, and now you're really putting it to the test.
Yeah, it feels like this is where the rubber really meets the road. What's the main point of this phase for you?
Well, the primary objective is twofold, really. It's about confirming that the treatment is actually effective,
Right.
but this time in a much larger group of patients.
Okay, so much bigger than those earlier phases.
Much bigger. And critically, the patients in phase 3 should closely resemble the types of patients who will actually be using the drug if it gets approved.
I see. So it's about real-world representation.
Absolutely.
Now, alongside efficacy, safety is always a huge concern, right?
Absolutely. You're gathering much more robust safety data in phase 3 because you're looking at it for a longer period of time and in a wider range of patients.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do you ensure that the data you get from these trials is really reliable? Because I always hear about the importance of randomization in this context.
Randomization is absolutely key to minimize bias.
Okay.
What we do is randomly assign patients to either receive the new treatment or a control group.
Okay, so like a coin toss, basically, for each patient.
Exactly. And that control group could be a placebo
Okay.
or it could be an existing treatment if there is a standard of care already.
I see. So you're comparing how the new treatment stacks up against either nothing or the best available option.
Exactly.
Now, these trials aren't all designed the same way, are they?
No, not at all. There are different types of trials depending on what you're trying to show. You have superiority trials,
Okay.
which aim to prove that the new treatment is better than the control.
Makes sense.
Then you have equivalence trials, which try to show that the new treatment is just as good as the existing treatment.
Okay.
And then you have non-inferiority trials.
Non-inferiority.
Yeah, these are interesting because they're trying to demonstrate that the new treatment is not significantly worse than the existing one.
So it doesn't have to be better, just not worse by a certain margin.
Exactly. And you might choose this type of trial if the new treatment has other advantages, like fewer side effects, or if it's easier to administer.
Okay. So the design really depends on the context and the goal of the research.
That's right.
Now, these phase 3 trials, they sound like huge undertakings
Oh, they are.
involving so many people and so many resources.
Mhm.
Does that put a lot of pressure on getting the design right from the beginning?
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking massive investments in terms of both time and money.
Yeah.
And if the design of the trial is flawed, it can really set you back years.
Right. So it's not just about recruiting a lot of patients, it's about recruiting the right patients.
That's exactly right. You have to be very careful about who you include in the study. You want a sample that's representative of the target population, the people who will ultimately be using the drug if it gets approved.
Okay. So how do you make those decisions about patient selection? What kind of criteria do you use?
Well, it depends on the drug, the condition you're targeting, and a whole host of other factors. You want to think about things like age, gender, the severity of their illness, other medications they might be taking, even things like their lifestyle and their genetic background.
Wow, so many things to consider.
It's a balancing act, really, because on the one hand, you want a diverse group of patients so that your results are generalizable.
Right, you want it to reflect the real world.
Exactly. But on the other hand, you don't want so much variability that it becomes difficult to detect a clear signal from the treatment.
I see.
So sometimes researchers might decide to exclude patients with certain comorbidities or who are taking certain medications if those factors are likely to interfere with the results.
So it's a strategic decision about who you include to really maximize the quality of the data you get.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we mentioned different trial designs earlier, like parallel and crossover trials. Can you tell us a bit more about when you might choose one over the other?
Sure. So in a parallel design, you have two or more groups of patients, and each group receives a different treatment for the entire duration of the study.
So one group gets the new drug, one group gets the placebo or the standard treatment, and that's it.
That's it. They stay in their assigned groups throughout the trial.
Okay, and that's pretty common, right?
Yeah, that's the most common approach. It's straightforward to implement and analyze.
Okay, but you also have crossover trials.
Right. In a crossover design, patients actually switch treatments at some point during the study.
So they might start on the new drug, then switch to the placebo, or vice versa.
Exactly.
And what's the advantage of that?
Well, it can be really helpful for reducing variability because you're essentially comparing each patient to themselves. So you're controlling for all those individual differences that might influence how they respond to the treatment.
That's really clever.
But there are some caveats with crossover trials. For one, you have to make sure there's a sufficient washout period between treatments.
Washout period.
Yeah, that's the time it takes for the effects of the first treatment to wear off completely before they start the second one.
Okay, so you don't want any lingering effects muddying the waters.
Exactly.
You want to be sure you're measuring the effects of the second treatment in isolation.
Right. And another thing to consider is that crossover trials are not suitable for all types of treatments or conditions.
Like if the condition is progressive, or if the treatment has long-lasting effects even after you stop taking it.
Exactly. Those situations would be much better suited for a parallel design.
Okay, so the choice of design is really important, and it depends on a lot of factors. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about something called population pharmacokinetic analysis. It sounds kind of complicated,
It can be a little technical, but it's a really important part of drug development.
and I hear it happens somewhere around phase 2 usually.
That's right, usually during phase 2 or even earlier.
Okay.
What we're doing is using data collected from patients to create a model of how the drug behaves in the body.
Okay, like how it gets absorbed, distributed, broken down, eliminated, all of that.
Exactly. It's all about understanding those ADME properties.
ADN?
Stands for absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion.
Okay, gotta love those acronyms.
Right. And the key here is that we're not just looking at average values.
Okay.
We're looking at how those ADME properties vary between individuals.
I see. So why some people might process the drug faster than others.
Exactly. And we can then use that information to refine the design of the phase 3 trials.
So you might adjust the dose for certain patients, or exclude patients who might be at higher risk of side effects.
That's right. It's about personalizing the treatment as much as possible, even before it gets approved.
That's really interesting. So it's all about understanding those individual differences and using that knowledge to optimize the treatment strategy. Now, let's say we've completed phase 3 and we have all this great data showing that the drug is safe and effective. What's the next big hurdle?
Regulatory approval.
Right, that's where agencies like the FDA come in.
Exactly. The FDA in the US, the EMA in Europe, and similar agencies around the world.
Okay, so how does that process actually start? Where do you begin?
Well, before you can even start clinical trials in humans, you have to submit something called an IND application.
An IND.
That stands for Investigational New Drug.
Got it.
And it's basically a request to the regulatory agency for permission to test your new drug in people.
Okay, so what goes into an IND application? It sounds like a pretty hefty document.
Oh, it is. It has to
Yeah.
include all the preclinical data you've gathered.
Okay, so data from lab studies and animal studies.
Exactly. And that includes information on the drug's chemistry, manufacturing, and controls how it's made and how its quality is assured.
Right, so they want to make sure it's being produced safely and consistently.
Absolutely. You also have to include the proposed protocol for your clinical trial.
So that's the detailed plan for how the trial is going to be conducted.
That's right, including things like the patient population, the dosages, the endpoints you'll be measuring, all of that.
And all this is to demonstrate to the FDA that it's safe to move forward with testing the drug in humans.
Exactly. They want to make sure you've done your due diligence and that the potential benefits outweigh the risks.
So what happens after you submit the IND?
Well, the FDA has 30 days to review it.
Okay, so a month of waiting anxiously.
Pretty much. And during that time, they might have questions. They might ask for additional information, or in some cases, they might issue a clinical hold.
A clinical hold.
Yeah, that means they're not allowing you to start the trial until you've addressed certain concerns they have, usually about safety.
So it's a really critical period. Now let's fast forward a bit. We've gone through phase 2, phase 3. We have all this data. What's the bar for getting marketing approval from the FDA?
Well, the ultimate standard is something called substantial evidence
Substantial evidence of what exactly?
of both safety and effectiveness.
Okay.
And typically that means evidence from well-controlled clinical trials, like those phase 3 trials we were talking about.
And the FDA also takes into account what's called substantial clinical experience.
Right. That's the knowledge gained from using the drug in real-world settings after it's been approved.
So it's kind of like a continuous evaluation even after the drug is on the market.
Exactly. The FDA is always monitoring for any new safety concerns or unexpected effects.
Now, I know there are also these expedited pathways like fast-track approval. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, Fast Track is designed for drugs that address serious or life-threatening conditions where there's a significant unmet medical need.
Okay, so like a new treatment for a rare cancer or a debilitating genetic disease.
Exactly. In those cases, the FDA can expedite the review process.
Okay, and how does that actually work?
Well, it involves more frequent meetings and communication with the FDA, and it can also involve something called rolling review.
Rolling review.
Yeah, that means you can submit sections of your marketing application as they become ready rather than waiting until the whole thing is complete.
So it kind of streamlines the process.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that Fast Track doesn't lower the standards for approval.
Okay.
You still have to demonstrate safety and effectiveness to the same degree as any other drug.
So it's just a faster path, but the bar is still the same height.
Exactly right.
Now, we talked about those preclinical toxicology studies earlier. How do those factor into the later stages of drug development and the marketing application?
Well, those long-term toxicology studies are really crucial for supporting the approval process.
And remind me again, how long do those studies typically run for?
The standard is 6 months in rodents and 9 months in non-rodents, like dogs or monkeys.
Okay, so we're talking about really long-term exposure to see if any chronic toxicities emerge.
Exactly.
And those studies are guided by specific regulatory guidelines, right?
That's right. The ICH M3 and S4A guidelines.
ICH.
The International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, but basically they set the standards for these toxicology studies to make sure they're conducted consistently around the world.
Okay, so it's about harmonizing those standards across different countries.
That's exactly right.
Now, the pharmaceutical world is so diverse. Are there specific regulatory considerations for different types of products?
Absolutely.
Like I remember reading something about over-the-counter drugs for hyperphosphatemia requiring special approval.
Yes, that's a good example. You might think that OTC drugs wouldn't need the same level of scrutiny as prescription drugs.
Right, because they're available without a prescription.
But in the case of OTC drugs for hyperphosphatemia, the FDA actually classifies them as new drugs.
Really?
Yeah, and that means they have to go through the same rigorous approval process, including clinical trials, as any other new drug.
Wow, that's surprising. What about treatments for those really rare diseases that affect only a small number of people?
Well, for those rare diseases, there's a special designation called orphan drug designation.
Okay, and how does that work?
Essentially, it provides incentives for companies to develop treatments for these rare diseases.
Okay, because those treatments might not be profitable otherwise.
That's right. So the orphan drug designation provides things like tax breaks, fee waivers, and even market exclusivity for a certain number of years to encourage investment in these areas.
You see, so it's about incentivizing research into those areas where there might not be a huge market, but where there's still a significant need.
Exactly right. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves access to safe and effective treatments, regardless of how rare their condition might be.
Absolutely. Now, I also came across something called the FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program. What's that all about?
That's the FDA's system for making sure that all clinical trials are conducted ethically and according to regulations.
So it's about protecting the rights and safety of the participants.
Exactly, and it's also about ensuring the integrity of the data that's collected.
So they're making sure everything is done by the book and that their results are reliable.
That's right. It's a really important part of the whole drug development process.
And finally, how do patents play into the regulatory approval process?
Well, companies have to submit information about any patents that cover their new drug as part of their marketing application.
Okay, so patents for the drug itself, the manufacturing process, any unique formulations.
Exactly, all of that. And this information is important for the FDA because it helps them determine how long the company might have exclusive rights to sell the drug.
So it affects when generic versions of the drug might become available.
That's right, which has implications for competition and pricing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked
Mm.
about phase 3 trials, the FDA approval process, and all the complexities involved in getting a new drug to market. What are some of the big picture lessons learned that you think are really important for people to understand?
I think one of the key takeaways is that drug development is a long and challenging process. It takes years of research, countless hours of work, and significant financial investment to bring a new drug from the lab bench to the patient's bedside.
And it's not a linear process either, right?
Yeah.
There are setbacks along the way, unexpected results. Sometimes you have to go back to the drawing board.
Absolutely. There are failures, there are delays, but it's important to learn from those experiences and to keep pushing forward.
I think that's a really important point.
It's about perseverance and a commitment to innovation.
And another thing that really struck me is the incredible level of collaboration involved in this whole process.
Absolutely. You have scientists, clinicians, regulators, patients, advocacy groups all working together.
Yeah, it's really a team effort.
It is.
Now, as we look to the future, what are some of the emerging trends or technologies that you think are going to shape the world of drug development?
Well, I think artificial intelligence is going to play an increasingly important role.
AI. Everyone's talking about AI these days.
It's already being used in some areas of drug discovery and development,
Okay.
but I think we're only just scratching the surface of what's possible.
So how might AI be used in the future?
Well, it could be used to analyze those huge data sets we were talking about, to identify new drug targets, or to design new molecules with specific properties.
Okay.
It could also help to optimize clinical trials, to personalize treatments for individual patients, to predict drug interactions, all sorts of things.
It sounds like AI has the potential to really revolutionize this whole field.
I think it does.
But there are also some ethical considerations and challenges that come with AI, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, who owns the intellectual property if an AI designs a new drug?
That's a big question, and one that we're still grappling with.
Yeah, it's definitely something we're going to have to figure out as AI becomes more sophisticated or more integrated into our lives.
Absolutely.
Well, this deep dive has been
It
fascinating.
really has.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've given everyone a much better understanding of the incredible journey involved in bringing a new medicine to market.
I hope so.
And for you, our listener, I want to leave you with this question. What do you think is the most critical element in this whole process? Is it the initial scientific discovery, the design of the clinical trials, the analysis of the data, or navigating the regulatory landscape? Let us know your thoughts, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.